Okay, guys. We're trying to get set up so that the iPad can come closer so I'm not standing behind a podium, which is okay for a 20-minute keynote. Well, okay, I made it 25. But what I want to do, doesn't make a couple of statements up front, and then I'll open up for a second. That question at the end is a really important one, because if you've got people who want structure, the danger is you get forced into structure and somebody will always fill the gap, right? So there are a couple of things around this. One is you provide a structure which recognizes uncertainty. Right? So if anybody wants, we have free downloadable forms for this. So exactly, if you give people forms, they feel happy, all right? So I was working with Cisco, they couldn't get it, so I went into a back room and produced some forms, and they've stood ever since, all right? So you basically say, okay, in this problem, what aspects of this are complicated, what are complex? You very rarely have things in obvious or chaos, yeah? If it's complicated, what resource do you need to find out the right solution? When will you report? Who will do it? What's the evidence that there is a solution which can be discovered? And that's a form. Yeah, if it's complex, yeah, then it's a very different question. You ask, who has got a credible hypothesis about something which would make a difference? Yeah? And then you test them for coherence, and any coherent idea gets a small amount of time and resource to run a safe-to-fail experiment, but the experiments run in parallel, not in sequence. You don't choose one, because if you choose one, everybody will be committed to getting that right. Yeah? And we have a form for each experiment. It says, you know, why is it coherent? Justify it. Yeah, what would it look like if it succeeds? How would you amplify it? What would it look like if it fails? How would you dampen it? Is this naive? That means using an asset which has never been used to look at the problem before. Yeah, and one of the experiments must be naive. So to give you a couple of examples, my two favorite, I used a Lutheran liturgical design specialist to look at knowledge transfer in hospitals, because liturgical design is about compressing complex ideas into memorable form. And that method is still in use in Bellingham over in Washington State. Yeah? Joe Jenner and I actually put anthropologists into Holiday Inns worldwide. And we didn't send in anthropologists who studied industry. We took a postdoc team who were studying the incidents and the cultural factors affecting Krobos-Yakos disease amongst women in Papua New Guinea. Sorry, if you don't know it, ritual consumption of the dead is a responsibility of women in Papua New Guinea. If you consume people's brains, you get Krobos-Yakos disease. So it's a problem, and it's an anthropological problem because it's a deep-seated tradition and it's a medical thing. And yeah, I put it up there with the fact I'm not allowed to mention evolution when I work with the Ebola management teams down in Dallas. It's that level of primitivism, all right? And you're trying to handle it, all right? So we actually parachuted them into Holiday Inns worldwide to study Holiday Inns, which meant they were really cheap because the entire cost for a research team was less than you spend on one day of a McKinsey's consultant. And they thought Holiday Inns was luxury accommodation, all right, compared with where they'd been. They actually spotted systematic sexual abuse in the kitchens within 24 hours. Because actually anthropologists are finely tuned to power. It's kind of like they're paranoid, they're very finely tuned to it. But then they wrote a paper on how the organization actually worked, what the natural authority structures were. And we could compare that with the real authority structures, and we could map them against each other. That's also an example by way of the complex systems technique. You map the situation before you decide what the solution will be. You don't start with deciding what you want it to be and close the gap. You start with where it is, what can we change? Yeah, that's fun. I'll come on to that on culture in a minute. So you see the principle there? You've got a portfolio. Executives expect a portfolio. So there's a portfolio control form. Yeah, if actually there isn't a naive one, they send it back. They know when they'll get the results. You see what we're doing here? We're creating structure which actually allows people to feel comfortable with uncertainty because they've got it constrained. Right? Now, I'll give you an example of a couple of the techniques we're looking at the moment before I move on to narrative. Right? Yeah, that's actually a narrative map. That's from PricewaterhouseCoopers Data Analytics Group's Worldwide CEO Survey. I'll talk about that in a minute. Right? Let me give you two examples of techniques. Yeah? One of the ones I created originally for DSDM Consortium way back, right, was based on biological mutation. So when you're stressed, mutation rates increase in any natural system, which means you get more disease, you get more failure, but also you get more novelty, therefore you get things which can survive. Under conditions of stress, you increase variety in the system, you don't reduce variety. Now, this is kind of like a basic biological lesson. The trouble with things like SAFe and Six Sigma is they reduce variety in the system, which is the exact opposite of what you need under uncertainty, because it means you don't see things come in left field. I'll show you a bit of statistics on that later. Right? So one of the things we did is we put, this is the early days of RAD-JAD, right? So we put a rapid application development team together. So these are fast prototypers. One day, working with some users, they knocked out a prototype. Yeah? And we dealt with what was called an intractable problem, not a tractable problem. i.e. something where people have been trying to find a solution for a long time but haven't found one. Those are where people will take some risks. Yeah, and what's the risk of a JAD team? It's nothing, all right? So basically, we'll throw together a prototype. We then pass it on to another prototype team on an 8-hour time difference. Yeah, and they weren't allowed access to the original user requirement. All they saw was the output of the JAD team, and they were told to improve it. Then they passed it on to another JAD team on another 8-hour time difference, who were given the same instruction. If you know that game, we call it Chinese whispers in the UK. You whisper into somebody's ears, they whisper into the next, and they whisper into the next. Yeah, so it then came back in, yeah? And every time we've run that, and we've been bringing it back in lately, the users say, God, we wouldn't have thought of that. That's brilliant. Can we have it? Yeah? Because what you're doing is you're deliberately introducing mutations so you get more variety, and you're not constraining the second set of teams by what the users say they want, so they actually make false assumptions. You get variety into the system. Once you've done that, then it goes into Scrum. You see the back? Yeah? Now, the other thing I'm going to talk about in a minute is this new stuff we're doing. If anybody's interested, we're about to announce multi-client programs to develop methods. I moved all of our method development out of the commercial company into a university, and everything will be done collaboratively. And everything will be done over a year to 2 years. So we're just about to announce a big program with Excelos, if you know them. Okay, they own the Prince2 methodology for project management. So over the next 2.5 years, we're going to collaboratively develop a complexity-based version of Prince2. Yeah, Prince2 Agile already contains the Kinevian framework, but it doesn't have the tools and the methods. If anybody wants to talk about that, I'll happily take you through it over lunch. Because it basically says Scrum fits here, pre-Scrum techniques fit here, time boxes fit here, and there's nothing wrong with waterfall. What actually matters in waterfall is you get early alerts if something is going wrong, because people won't tell you early enough if it's going wrong. So this is a thing called anticipatory alerts. Yeah? So, and that, at the end of the 2 years, will produce a formal method properly accredited, not thrown together based on examples. The other one we're looking at the moment is software tests, and I've just come from launching that in New York. Yeah? And the idea is to move over to continuous capture of software testing records so you can create what are called anticipatory triggers. We've done this in the aircraft manufacturing industry. We get people to observe anomalies which aren't serious enough to be reported, but where they're worried about. We can then look at patterns in that to actually identify early signs of metal fatigue. So we're looking at the same thing in software testing. Yeah, and that was original stuff we did on counterterrorism and before and after 9/11. How do you realize before after the event, you all know what was significant? How do you actually trigger people to look at things before the significance is apparent? Yeah? And the other one, which I'll go through the method on in a minute, we're looking at user requirements capture. I have a sort of mission to get rid of systems analysts. Because the trouble is, a systems analyst comes in with some idea of what they think should happen. Yeah? It's just to give an illustration, when we did the original method development for everything when I was in IBM, we worked in Denmark so we could facilitate in English, but people would speak in Danish. So the facilitators couldn't engage in the content. Because the minute the facilitator engages in the content, they start to influence the outcome. Yeah? What was interesting, a lot of consultants hate it because they like to influence the outcome. Yeah? But actually that's a bad idea because they produce unsustainable solutions, or the solution they did last time. Right? So what we're now starting to look at is to actually, and this is a narrative-based approach, but what's called micro-narrative or micro-observations, is you take a sample of the users and on a continuous basis, ideally over 1 or 2 months, they actually, every time they have an idea, they record it as a narrative. Every time they get frustrated by something, they report as a narrative. Every time they get that, oh my God, why the hell can't I have something which makes my life easier here? They record it. You get the principle? Now, I'll show you how we do this in a minute. It's called high abstraction metadata. We then actually, and that's ungameable. Yeah, so people don't know what the purpose of it is. From that, we can create dispositional maps which show clusters. Once we get to a significant cluster, we allocate a pair programming team to the cluster to knock out a prototype to say, well, I've got direct access now to user experience. It's not a formally constructed story, and it's definitely not an epic, right? It's not something which analysts have put together to inform programmers. The programmers now have direct contact with a cluster of real-time data, and they produce something, and then we take it to the users and say, would this help? Right? Do you see where we're going with that? So you move further and further back the cycle, because if you change the way you define what's needed, you start to do things before people start to define massive systems developments. And of course, once they start to define massive system developments, then it becomes very difficult to do Agile because they worry about the overall control of the system. So that's kind of like the ecosystem type method. Yeah? Okay, now what I'm going to do in this session is go through narrative research techniques, and there's kind of like an open invitation on this to people to participate in the programs through the university. Just to be clear, there are patents on some of this stuff. Yeah? So it's open to participate, but we've had people who just take it and copy it. They will get sued, right? Yeah, but the whole idea is to make this stuff open, right? So if you join one of the programs, that's there, okay? Before I do that, anybody got any burning questions they want to ask from the last session? Yeah, before I move on to that. Burning questions? No? Nobody wants to have an argument? I keep explaining this in the Welsh tradition, right? If we're nice to you, it means we don't really trust you. When we trust you, we have an argument. I didn't explain this to my wife, and we had a rather difficult period, you know. Yeah, sorry, you'll have to ask for the mic. This is not. Then you'll have to find somebody who knows how to turn on the mic. And then we'll have lunch, all right?
Okay, so it's just a comment from you made a comment a moment ago around system analysts, how you want to get rid of them, but then you used a different sort of example. So I was just curious about the system analyst specific.
Okay. I want to get rid of the aspect of systems analysts which involves interview, and I'll go through that in a minute. It's where the analyst goes into the community, defines things, and writes it up. Yeah. I think how we actually, I think there's a different way we need to go, but that's where I'm starting to think in terms of a whole new approach to architecture. Because at the moment, architecture is based on an engineering diagram, not on the way that we map ecosystems. Yeah, which is why we get these TOGAF, non-TOGAF wars, but they're really fighting about the same thing. All right? So we need to start to think of the environment we're working with as a complex ecosystem with multiple potentialities, only parts of which can be reduced to an engineering drawing. Yeah? Now, the net already works like that. Yeah? It's an architecture within which things interoperate, and you don't know what's going to happen until they happen, and then they make sense. Right? Now, there's no reason where we can't move that across with more discipline. Yeah? I argued back on Corba committees back in the 80s that we should actually start to think about people as objects as well as software as objects, because that would give us a new approach to organizational design in which people objects could interact with software objects. Yeah, and there's actually a body of stuff we're doing on that, working on a whole bunch of research on crews. So if you look at crews in, say, aircraft crews or medical crews, people are trained in role and role expectations, so you can assemble a crew without the need for team formation. Yeah, because they all know how to interface with the other aspects of the system, therefore the system can actually change and adapt very quickly. And it's no coincidence that all military environments use crews, not teams.
What's the difference between a crew?
Okay, in a crew, you're trained in role and role expectation, and they also entry into the crew is nearly always ritualized, normally putting on some type of uniform. What ritual does is it changes the cognitive activation pattern, so it aligns your identity with your role for a limited period of time. Yeah? And it takes about a 2 or 3 year process to design and create a crew-based structure, but then you can assemble people across silos without the need for team formation. And you've got predictability and response. If you look at Viking Sutcliffe's work, they identify crews share failure, teams don't. Yeah, because in the crew, it's the role sharing failure as part of the role. It's not the person or the team which has a personal relationship sharing it. I think somebody on the stage made a really good point. There's an over-focus on self-help and self-development in Agile, yeah, when actually there are much better ways. I mean, I've always said this. You go to the military because the military work with average people. Yeah, and the last Prime Minister of Britain famously said, I want all our schools to be above average, which proved his wasn't, right? Yeah. We need to start developing methods and tools which aren't predicated on people being brilliant leaders, highly motivated individuals. We need to start to build methods and tools based on how things really are on a day-to-day basis, and that's what the military environment do. So we tend to go to there. If we can explain why it works, cognitive activation, then we can replicate it. Yeah. Any more? Yeah.
So do you think that the military is actually pushing innovation? I mean, I haven't seen that.
No, they're really good in battlefield at pushing innovation. I mean, I do a lot of work with the Marines. They're really good at it. Yeah, and special forces. Yeah, so you would actually be amazed. I mean, the interesting thing is the military environment is terribly bureaucratic in peacetime and tremendously adaptive in wartime. It switches from a bureaucratic structure to a distributed command structure. It doesn't privilege one over the other. It uses the right one in context. Yeah? And I think also they put more emphasis on training because when they actually practice, they can't afford to fail. Yeah? Now, I think one of the problems with Scrum is nobody can afford it to fail because they don't bring the failure early enough. Yeah? The resource for a Scrum process already requires a degree of commitment, which is problematic. Right? Now, remember I talked about parallel safe-to-fail experiments around any coherent idea? That's a massive conflict resolution technique. And it's a cost reduction technique. Because I can agree that your idea is coherent even though I think you're wrong. Yeah, so there's less epistemological commitment to saying, I think it's coherent, I disagree with it, but I can see there's some logic in it, therefore we run an experiment. Because if I'm only going to run one experiment on one subject, then people will overclaim the evidence because they want the resource. If you overclaim the evidence, you will not admit to failure because you won't get it next time, and you see how the cycle goes downhill. Yeah? And the argument here is that Scrum is too largely grained. Yeah, it is too coarsely grained. Yeah. Not that it's not valuable, but it's too coarsely grained for initial investigation. There's too much commitment. Look what I'm doing with the two techniques I mentioned. You're talking about 2 or 3 man days. Yeah, you're not talking about a whole team over a 2-week process with a lot of commitment. Yeah? And the more you can do that sort of stuff up front, the more you actually allow hypotheses to change and generate. We do a lot of this in real conflict resolution, by the way. Is not force people into some bland consensus, but recognize legitimate differences and allow those differences to evolve. Now, and I'll show you a slide from some of the work we're doing in Colombia at the moment, because that's very relevant to getting. There's no difference between peace and reconciliation in Colombia, between the FARC and the Colombian government, and actually dealing in the average IT community's relationship with their users. All right, there's a similar historical precedent. So we can probably deal with one and the other. Okay, one last thing, all right? I gave you the example of the people don't see the gorilla. Just let me give you the facts behind this because it's very relevant. The most anybody in this room scans of what's in front of them, and this is on a good day if you're really focused, is about 5%. That's the most you scan. Most of the time, it's 3 or 4%. Yeah, a radiologist is up in the high 4, high 5%. Okay? What you then do is you match that partial scan against stored memories. And the memories, by the way, aren't just stored in the brain, they're stored in the body, the brain, your tools, and the environment. We now know that consciousness is a distributed function of the body, the brain, and its environment. It's not co-located with the brain. If the brain dies, you lose consciousness, but it doesn't mean that all of your consciousness is in the brain, which is why anybody who believes in the singularity kind of like hasn't done their basic science. If you genuinely believe in the singularity, your brain is probably ossified to the point where it can be transferred to a computer. Yeah? It's far more sophisticated than that. It's called post-Cartesian concepts of consciousness, right? So a radiologist has 30 to 40,000 patterns associated with their skill and training as a radiologist. Yeah? And the most frequently used ones get activated first. So they scan 4 or 5% of the X-ray, and they do a first fit pattern match, not a best fit pattern match. Which means if they haven't seen something or they don't expect to see it, and anything other remotely matches, they'll go with it. Yeah? Now, if you think about this in evolutionary terms, it makes a lot of sense. If you think about the early hominoids on the savannas of Africa, something large and yellow with very sharp teeth runs towards you at high speed. Do you want to autistically, gather all the available information, look up a catalogue of the flora and fauna of the African veldt, and having identified lion, look at best practice case studies on how to deal with lions? By that time, the only document I know of any use to you will be the book of Jonah from the Old Testament, which is the only example I know of how to escape from the digestive tract of a large carnivore. I don't recommend it. We evolved to make decisions very, very quickly based on a partial data scan privilege on our most recent experiences. And the other really scary thing is we privilege negative over positive experiences. We actually record failure, we often miss success. And in evolutionary terms, that's because avoidance of failure is a more successful strategy than imitation of success. Therefore, it provides more guidance. No? Anybody told their children stories? Right. Do you tell stories about how Mummy and, Janet and John, sorry, Bob and Betsy, whatever it is over here. Is it Bob and Betsy? Is that the Canadians? It's Janet and John in the UK. It's those appalling books you get when you're very young and learn to read. Dick and Jane. Yeah. Okay, so you don't say Dick and Jane stayed at home and did what Mummy and Daddy told them and everything was fine. Would they really bother with that? No, it's Dick and Jane went into the forest despite what Mummy and Daddy had told them, and the evil witch almost ate them, but we make sure it has a happy ending because we do want us to sleep at night, all right? Yeah. We tell them stories of failure. We don't actually give them goals or strategic targets. Yeah? Because actually avoidance of failure is a more successful learning mechanism. It allows people to develop in novel ways. You share failure so people don't commit the same mistakes, but you leave open pathways. Yeah? If you write your values down, let's just give you some 101 anthropology. If you write your values down, you just lost them. Because what you've done is told people what language to feed back to you. And that's what they'll do. Yeah? It's just the way it is, all right? I learned that in IBM. The minute IBM changed its value system, all the slides got changed. In fact, I think find and replace function was entirely designed for this process. We went from this to on-demand this overnight. Yeah, because it was very simple. Oh, that's the words of power. We'll deal with it, and that's what happens, right? The reality is the work we do on values change is actually define negative boundaries with stories about things which everybody agrees have failed, and then leave open where they go, but with feedback loops so we can create direction. And that's both more sustainable and it's less likely to fail. Because the minute you declare a goal, anybody been through a change initiative in the last 10 years? Did they deliver what they promised? Okay, so somebody announces a change initiative, you listen to 3% of what they say, it activates the most recently experienced patterns which are negative. How do you think you perceive it? The minute you announce you're launching a major new method and from now on there will be no more problems with software development, do you really think you haven't done that before? And do you really think there's no memory of it? All right? Yeah, it's not the way it works. Yeah? That's why we're trying to move software development into small incremental changes before people actually set objectives. Yeah? You start journeys, you don't try and achieve goals. Yeah? You measure vectors. Vectors are speed and direction of travel for intensity of effort. You don't measure outcome. And by the way, some other base science for you. Wherever people are working for explicit, measurable goals, it destroys intrinsic motivation. You can have the reference on that in the meta-study. Extrinsic goals destroy intrinsic motivation. There is no evidence to contradict that. Yeah, and where do we need intrinsic motivation? Education, health, software development. Where do we set outcome-based targets? It's actually a disaster. Yeah? Okay. So this is a slide from Gaping Void. If anybody knows Gaping Void? Okay, if it wasn't for Dilbert and Gaping Void, I would go insane. Right? You can actually go onto the Gaping Void website, and one of these will come down every day. I've set myself a constraint on the blog this month. I'm just going to write a blog about whatever the Gaping Void cartoon is, which is actually it's quite an interesting experience. I've got to day 4 at the moment, all right? And I now know that Hugh knows I'm doing it, so I'm getting really worried about this because I was trying to keep it quiet, all right? So I've got a funny feeling either way. We're actually just announced a big partnership with Gaping Void to actually measure culture by not asking people the traditional Likert scales, but by presenting cartoons. People pick the cartoon which represents the culture. They then interpret the cartoon, and from that we draw maps, but I'll come on to that in a minute. Yeah? Cartoons, by the way, are really good sense-making devices because people interpret cartoons in common. They don't interpret pictures in common. Because there's a huge amount of information in a picture, there's less information in a cartoon. Yeah, and that's one of the reasons it works effectively. But just remember that, you only scan that much. And by the way, if anybody's offended by this, I really do not mean to offend. But these days, the Agile community is largely composed of people with mild or Asperger's syndrome. Yeah? The reason is you have to have a high degree of mathematics in order to code these days. I wouldn't be up to it anymore. I mean, I did pure mathematics at university, but I'm dyslexic. Yeah? Which, by the way, correlates with innovation. Because actually, to code, you've got to have that sort of tight focus. Right? The trouble is that inclines people to structure. Yeah? When actually the user community is inclined very differently. Yeah? I always recommend people read The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. Anybody read that one? Yeah, it's a wonderful book, all right? If you haven't read it, go and read it. I normally send that to IT people to read before I run a workshop with them. And then say, you've got to realize that that's actually, it's more extreme, but that's how the users see you. You're trying to put them into a structure where they're just going along with it because they don't understand it. I mean, you know, data flow diagrams were designed so that users could sign something they didn't understand, but we could hold them accountable for later, if we're all honest about it, in terms of the way it works. Okay, so the most important thing that says in that quote is what isn't being said. Yeah? Now, I've gone through this already, so I'll just briefly summarize it quickly. This kind of gives you the journey we went through to get here. And for some reason, let's start again. Okay. Get there in a minute. Cool. Right, now it's working. Okay, so a couple of things. Right? Anybody filled out a survey? Yeah? These days, everybody's using Net Promoter Score. Has anybody noticed that? Everywhere you go, it's would you recommend us? That's an example of what's called Goodhart's law in economics. Yeah? Any statistical instrument used for policy loses all value. Marilyn Stratton's variation of that is the minute a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a measure. Yeah? Because actually it was a good measurement system, but then people created it as a target. You know what they get out of it, right? So we got one in IBM, right? It came in, does your manager consult you on a regular basis, scale of 0, not at all, 10 all the time? Does that sound familiar? That's called a hypothesis-based question. You know what the answer is. So I phoned up HR, and I got straight through to the worldwide head. I was on a hit list, or sorry, an early warning list. Well, I was in a lot of trouble. We just spent $50,000 of their money proving that astrology was more accurate than Myers-Briggs in predicting team behavior. Well, I got them to pay for me to do a comparative study, and I threw in an extra questionnaire, and we had an astrologer cast the horoscopes, and then we got them rewritten in management speak, and we did a proper control. For some reason, they were upset about this. You know? And I said, how am I meant to answer this? All right? I've got 3 managers and 5 people I take business direction from, and probably some others I'm meant to, but I don't know about, because that's the nature of IBM politics. Sometimes they consult me, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they should, and sometimes they shouldn't. And she said, average your experience over the year and stop making trouble. And I then said, and you call yourself HR in a research group, but Fortunately, she put the phone down before she actually heard that, otherwise it might have been more dangerous, right? We got our own back on that. We actually ran a controlled experiment over the next 2 years in which we actually got people to fill out their employee satisfaction surveys based on an algorithm. We only had about 1/3 of IBM Global Services do this, and we actually saw if we could modify the behavior of the HR department by modifying the input on the satisfaction survey, and we proved we could, and for some reason they got upset about that as well. Never upset techies with access to, it was the way it worked. Now, the problem is everybody knows what answer you want. Okay? So we take a very different approach, which I'll come to in a minute, all right? But you can't afford a survey. People know what results you expect to get. It also creates performance anxiety because if it's an evaluative survey, you worry about the consequences of what you say. Yeah? I will never evaluate hotel staff badly because I know how badly they're paid. Yeah? And I'm not prepared to be part of them being punished further. And if I was in their shoes, I wouldn't be giving me good service. Yeah? So I'm not prepared to be part of that. So you can't trust my response. We do a lot of work at the moment on patient journeys in hospitals, where we're getting patients to continuously capture narrative experience rather than fill out surveys. Because all the evidence is nobody scores medical staff badly, because they don't want to do that. So you can't trust the results and you don't get the data early enough. Yeah? So it's negative and positive. So we've got problems on that, right? Focus groups. Anybody run workshops? Okay, you bias them within 15 minutes. That's the average. Yeah? We actually run experiments with 3 facilitators. Anybody wants to go and do this, it's quite a cool technique. You put one facilitator in to lead the group, the other sits at the back and monitors the first one, and the third leaves the room and does their email. The minute the monitor thinks that the lead facilitator is influencing the group in any way, which is so easy to do. You can do it with body language, by privilege and thing, by who you invite. They stand up at the back of the room, at which point the first facilitator has to say, and now I hand you over to my colleague, leave the rule, the other one comes in, and the third one comes in to monitor. Yeah? Average on that is 15 minutes before they got taken out. In my experience, Sharon has got the world record. She managed 43 minutes, but she was really trying, all right, in terms of the way it works. Yeah? So you can't trust focus groups because the facilitator is in a position of authority. They control the interaction. It's also the first person to speak and can change how the group goes. Yeah? When we do, this is a whole body of stuff called complex facilitation. When we do group feedback, you might have 10 groups. We send a spokesman to each group. They present what the group has done, like in a circle. And they present to silence, and they listen in silence while the group discuss what was the same, what was different, what really surprised us. Because if you're not allowed to respond, you listen harder. Yeah? Then we rotate and rotate and rotate. So at no stage does somebody stand up and control the group up front. Now, this is a sort of paranoia about missing weak signals, which comes from the origins of this stuff in counterterrorism. Right? And if you actually look at longitudinal research, if anybody's done that, somebody goes and captures a whole body of narrative material, they transcribe it, they tag it. That's heavily culturally biased, and it doesn't give you real-time feedback loop. The one thing you absolutely need with a complex system is real-time feedback. Yeah, because the chance to influence things is very small. The earlier you learn something, the lower the cost of change. I'll talk about this finally in the context of cultural mapping. Right? Next thing. Anybody read Kleineman's book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow? Okay, it's worth reading. I mean, it's one of those interesting things. Economists, they think they're scientists, which I always find rather amusing in the face of all the evidence about their ability to predict. But they never go and talk with their colleagues. So we knew about this. He identified that when you think fast, it's a superficial response. And if that doesn't work, you drive down and you think more slowly. Now, that's called Novelty Receptive Autonomic Processing, and it was known about 15 years before he started his research, but that's the problem with people not going across disciplines, right? The point is, the superficial response is not the deep response. If you've ever seen people filling out a questionnaire with multiple linear scales, they just go cross, 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 don't they? Yeah? You actually have to increase the cognitive load on the brain so that the brain can't provide an automatic response. It goes deeper. Now, this, by the way, is one of the major differences between left and right brain. It's not about emotion and rationality, by the way. Don't believe that. That's just pseudoscience. It's nonsense. Yeah, there isn't a part of the brain which is rational and a part of the brain which is emotional. That's an old Greek dichotomy which continues to perpetuate. There is a difference in that when you pull your hand away from a hot plate, you don't think about it until after you've pulled it away. Because actually, it doesn't mean you haven't got free will. It's because actually the body is part of your consciousness. The brain is fine afterwards to double check if it got the response this time, because it may need to correct it later. Yeah? And the vast majority of what you do is handled in that way. It's called autonomic processing. You don't think about it. Yeah? If the autonomic doesn't work, the novelty receptive flips in, and that's very rare because it takes a huge amount of energy. I think novelty receptive is 20,000 items per second, whereas longitudinal autonomic is 20 million items per second. So you can see the energy consumption difference. Yeah? So we don't do it unless we have to. And so it's only when the old patterns don't work that we try something different. Which is why, if you want to innovate, you don't do creativity exercises, you starve people of resources. Because actually, when you starve people of resources, they're forced to think differently. Yeah? I mean, how many people have learned how to open beer bottles late at night without the proper instrument, all right? We're tremendously good at this as a species, all right? Yeah. The one method I don't recommend is after 5 or 6 beers, smashing a bottle on the top of a fence post and then wiping it with your hand. That's a bad idea because you can't see. I did that once when I was young, all right? But you learn from that. So if we can increase the cognitive load, we get deeper. We don't want a superficial response because people want to know. So that's a key aspect of this. Yeah? Next, we want people to describe, not evaluate. Description opens up possibility, evaluation closes them down. Give you an example. We're doing a project in Africa at the moment where we got young girls who've been genetically mutilated and raped, who are now acting as ethnographers to people they consider at risk in their own community, which turns out to be more therapeutic than actually being counseled. I.e., stopping other people go through the horror you've been through makes you feel better about yourself. Now, they're gathering multiple descriptive narratives self-interpreted at the point of origin. When we represent those narratives to experts in Washington or London, they evaluate the narratives, whereas the girls are describing their own condition. And in description, there are many available opportunities for intervention. In the evaluations, there are very few. Yeah, evaluation closes down options. It doesn't open them up. The more you can get to description. And you all know, don't you? You want people to describe the problem, not ask you if they've got the right solution. Yeah, it's always been about, stop telling me what you want, tell me what the problem is. Yeah, and we've all done that in multiple phases, and that's critical. So description is more important than evaluation. Also, this is probably less relevant to you guys, but it's critical in stuff we're doing in medical research. We need people to own their own narrative, not have their narrative interpreted by a computer or an expert. Yeah, we need people to be subjects in their own health journey, not objects of medical professionalism. And I would say the same is true of the user community. The user need to feel they have ownership of what their stories are, that ownership isn't being handed over to a third-party expert. Yeah, that's part of the issue on participation. Yeah? And finally on this, which is, you may not know this, but cave painting comes before language in human evolution. It turns out to be hugely important. Like everything in evolution, it's an accident. So somebody probably sketched something and it worked. But then what it does is, that means our language evolves from abstractions, not from naming things. If you look at Cretaceous languages and ape languages, they name things, so they're limited vocabulary. Human vocabulary is more or less unlimited. And what the argument is what it allows us to do, by moving up a level of abstraction into art, into poetry or music or painting, you can combine and recombine things in novel ways because you're dealing with an abstraction, not the concrete. Which is why, by the way, from a cognitive neuroscience point of view, we're saying the focus on STEM education is disastrous because scientific invention is based on art, not on STEM. Yeah, that's the history of human evolution. Yeah? Now, if you can move up a level of abstraction, you can discover novelty. You can't discover novelty if you make things too concrete. Yeah? That's why we start to talk about high abstraction metadata. And by the way, metadata based on text, you can write down about 5% of what you know. Anything which works on data analytics is working with very, very restricted information sets. Yeah? Because there's a limit. We always know more than we can say. We will always say more than we can write down. Yeah? The danger is we dumb down intelligence by focusing on that. So, remember the employee satisfaction survey? We take a different approach. So we go to 5% of the workforce every week or 10% every month. We'll do an annual one as well. And we say, what story would you tell your best friend if they were offered a job in your work group? Or which of these cartoons represents what it's like to work in? Or this is one we've been developing with Agile 42, which has had about 6 or 8 run out now, which is, think of a decision made recently which affected you personally, which summarizes what the culture of this company is like. Now, all of these are non-hypothesis questions designed to elicit a real description of something which happened. At no point is anybody evaluating anybody. Yeah? Then we ask people to place it, and this is the stuff which is developed and patented, basically onto a series of triangles. A triangle is brilliant because it forces cognitive load. Now you can see that one has 3 positive qualities. So you don't know what the right answer is. Yeah? Actually, each of those dots represents a story. So we're saying, did people make decisions based on principles? Did they do it logically? Did they think intuitively? So each of those dots represents somebody's story in the company. So that's the company pattern. So you can see this company is really good analytically. God help it in a crisis. And ethically, it may be a bit challenged in some departments when you look at the color coding, because there's no experience of making decisions based on principles. Yeah? So we're looking at patterns rather than prescriptions. Yeah? Because patterns describe the present, prescriptions make too many assumptions in that sort of sense. Right? So that allows us, with 6 triangles, to capture data very quickly. Another example is 360 feedback. Anybody done that? Just about to launch this for the Agile coaching market. It will only be sold through coaches. You get your leader to nominate X number of people. Those people download the app. Every time they interact with the leader, they record the interaction, and they index it onto 6 triangles with positive labels. Yeah, so they can't actually evaluate the leader. The leader then looks at the pattern on the triangles and basically puts their finger around it and say, what can I do tomorrow to create more like this and fewer like that? That's the new theory of change. What can I do tomorrow to create more like this, fewer like that, based on a distributed mass description of the present state? Yeah?
Isn't the danger that that becomes a metric then?
That's fine. So then we make it ungameable. So thank you for that. This is called the fitness landscape. Yeah? So this is a probability distribution. This is actually coming from the manufacturing sector. The left-hand one is civilian manufacturing. The right-hand one is military manufacturing. Okay? Now, what we got here is engineers continuously capturing their day-to-day experience. We first pioneered this with the US Army in Afghanistan. We said to company commanders, you don't have to write a patrol report if you keep observations up to date in real time. We got 100% compliance, and we got more valuable data. We're doing the same currently with social workers, with nurses, with doctors. Yeah, real-time observations, remember what I said in the keynote? Are more valuable than stuff you write up after the event, and it's less pain to do it. It's been easier to sell since the Internet of Things came along, because what we're putting is a human sensor network to overlay the mechanical sensors. Yeah, and in medical conditions, for example, we've accounted for 90% of the variation of oxygen take-up in people with the same physiological condition just on the way they index their experience. Yeah, because actually motivation has a major impact in chronic pulmonary care and chemotherapy and elsewhere. So the ability to measure that becomes critical, and that's kind of like the same sort of approach I've talked about here. Right? So what we got here then is a probability distribution, which is actually based on all of those factors. The de facto vertical dimension is job completion. Sorry, the de facto vertical dimension is rule compliance. The horizontal dimension is job completion. Now you can immediately see that they've got a problem. In civilian manufacture, there are 2 mutually incompatible states. You get the job done, or you follow the rules. Yeah? All the questionnaires, all the focus groups, all the expert interviews say they're doing both because they know that's the legally required right answer. The day-to-day micro-observations where people don't know what the right answer is, we show a pattern, and when we presented this to the board, nobody argued with me. Because they knew this was happening, but now we've got an evidence. Yeah? On the right, it looks like it's quite good in the top right, doesn't it? We've got rule compliance and job completion. until you click on that material, because in this we always go from the representation to the raw data without anybody interpreting it. That's why I don't like a lot of the analysts reuse the story. It's interpreted, not raw data. And every time you interpret something, you lose things, which may turn out to be significant later. When you click on that top right, you discover it's nuclear weapons testing, which creates an existential quality to rule compliance and job completion, which wouldn't work in other contexts. Yeah? We then got the get the job done, ignore the rules, and we got that really depressing one, I'm doing what I need to do to survive. We're seeing almost identical patterns in work we're doing with teachers and nurses at the moment. In a crisis, everything is brilliant. The really good ones break the rules to do their job, and a lot of people increasingly are doing what they have to do to survive. I'd say I'm seeing the same things in some agile communities with the big implementations, yeah, in terms of the same process. Now we look in the intervention method, you can see on the right, if I announced a wonderful new idea, yeah, we're going to have a massive safety program across the whole company, that's the traditional approach. Nobody would believe me because they've run them before. The cynical stories would grow around the water cooler, and it's too far away from where people are. So what I look for is what's called an adjacent possible. You see that small cluster that the two blue arrows are pointing to? That's closer to where I'd like to be, but it's also closer to where people are. It's called an adjacent possible in complexity, which is a great name. Yeah? I then click on that, and I say, what can I do tomorrow to create more like this and fewer like these? Not what can my employees do, because this is the board level position. What can I do as a board to enable more like this, fewer like that? One of the things they came up with is if you've got 10 years experience and somebody with 5 years experience signs it off, you can break these rules. Yeah? And that's actually, if you think about it, that's pragmatic. They had the evidence base for it. Yeah? So that's cool. But then every factory has their own framework. Yeah? So instead of having one-size-fits-all programs across the whole organization, basically the same raw data is represented for each group. So now each group says, what can we do tomorrow to create more like this, fewer like that? So everybody is moving in a contextually appropriate direction, but overall the system is shifting. Yeah? So you can see now why I said we use this for cultural mapping. Yeah? So we map the culture, we identify the clusters, and then it's what can we do tomorrow to create more like this, fewer like that, rather than a sort of abstract set of ideas which are basically privilege the facilitation. Yeah, that's the sort of quality values type system. Yeah? Now, that's also what we're starting to do. This is the conflict resolution one, and kind of like with this I'm going to finish. Right? So what we've done here was rather interesting. A couple of years ago, I spent an interesting week in Florida. I spent 2 weeks with my favorite client, which is one of the world's leading fashion houses. And this is my personal indulgence, all right? They don't stay in hotels with stars. If you need stars, you don't really understand quality. When I worked with their top 200, we were in a tent-based encampment in the Morocco desert. The Paris Ballet were flown in to perform a specially commissioned ballet, and we were all given white linen suits for the occasion, right? When we needed masks for ritual descent, in Intel, they bought them from a costume house. In this case, they had them specially commissioned in Venice, all right? So, you know, I allowed one client like this, right? And I went on from that to a gathering of 2,500 people from the NSA, the CIA, et cetera, to talk about human terrain mapping. This, by the way, is also called human terrain mapping. Yeah, that's how we use it in intelligence circles. And the bastards, I was one of 4 keynotes along with Clapper and 2 other people of equivalent distinction. And the bastards announced that Snowden was keynoting at their conference and didn't say which Snowden and put me on first. As Clapper said afterwards, he said, we made sure everybody turned up on time, right? Either way, I went on the stage with, shall we say, a degree of trepidation, all right? You know, it's kind of like I'd just been looking at something which says if I go to teach in Texas next year, then I've actually got to be careful because they're allowed open carry on campus. So I've declined, you know, I've actually got a manual how not to provoke your students, which got sent me, right? I've never not done that in my life, so I've decided not to go, right? What we then did is we presented a situation on Syria. 2,500 people interpreted it in 30 seconds in real time into 6 abstract triangles, and then we drew the maps from that. This is called real-time decision support. We're doing this with GCHQ in the UK at the moment. This is the British equivalent of NSA. We're presenting an infographic on cybersecurity breaches in Yahoo, but you would never present one on government to government. It would cause them to panic. Yeah, to all governments, every single civil servant has a limited slot to index it and actually write a story about why it wouldn't happen here. And from that, we can measure attitudes to cybersecurity, not compliance. Now, this is really, but if anybody wants to run this, by the way, we can run it for free for anybody for about the next 3 or 4 months because they want comparative data, right? You won't be able to change it, but you can run it, right? Lead indicators are critical because compliance is a lag indicator. Yeah? If the attitudes are right, you can relax the compliance measurement. And the same is true for software testing and everything else, right? You want lead indicators, not lag indicators. Yeah? This is one of the ones we've done in Colombia. This has actually got a huge amount of respondents. You can actually see there are 2 completely incompatible worldviews present. Yeah? Trying to get those people to talk to each other is a non-starter until you change the dispositional state. You could waste years of getting people together to talk about a problem, but they see the world so differently that they have got nothing in common. The strategy here, by the way, is to make the blue and green extremes more extreme so they split off, so the energy goes towards the center. Yeah? Now, that's how we map culture. Real-time feedback, infographics, rapid indexing, continuous measure, because you're trying to measure the dispositional state. That's what we're about to start to do on user requirements capture. Yeah? Because once a cluster starts to happen, remember the 82% didn't see the gorilla? Right, okay, 18% did. On this, they're a cluster before you have a decision. And the trouble is, just to really scare you, the ones who do see the gorilla come to believe they were mistaken if they talk with the people who didn't. Okay? Okay, what I've tried to do there is go on from the keynote to give you some idea of the tools and methods. And it's kind of like an open invitation to participate, because this sort of stuff is going to move forward university-based, multi-participant-based to create methods and tools. But the key thing is you first of all map the dispositional state of the present. You identify what you can change in that, and then you see what happens. You don't decide where you want to be. Because in a complex system, the same thing never happens again the same way twice by accident. You want a sense of direction. You want to start journeys. You don't want goals and objectives. Yeah? Now, the key thing about Cynefin, which is why it's got the citations it has, and by the way, it's taught to everybody. There isn't a police chief or a fire chief in the States who isn't taught it. Right? It's taught as the command course in the US Army, going from major to colonel. Anybody read McChrystal's book? Yep. Okay, the follow-through in that has got a lot of Cynefin in it. Yeah? Because basically what it says is there's a time to be ordered and a time to be complex. The key thing is to know the boundary between the two. You don't say everything is complex, it's all fluid, because human beings have developed a capacity to make things ordered. Yeah? So when it's ordered, you can set goals and objectives and you can use constraints. When it's unordered or complex, you have to describe the present and start journeys. If the present isn't disposed to what your journey, you have to change the present before you even start. If you haven't got an adjacent possible, you say, what can we do tomorrow to create something here? And when you get something there, then you can shift. So dispositions, not causality, journeys, not goals, and accept ambiguity. Okay, any questions?
Do you think emergent behavior will drive from the chaotic state into the complex state without any sort of changing?
I think a lot of people get chaos wrong, right? Chaos in Cynefin is a state of no constraints. So it's not a natural state. I see a lot of people, they draw Cynefin, they assume they have to have something in the chaos space. Yeah. Actually, you don't. It's always transitionary. If something drops into chaos accidentally, somebody will create constraints. To move into it, which is what we do on the mass sensing, it takes a lot of energy to do it. Yeah? I think what you've really got is stuff which is borderline chaos. Yeah? And there, yes, you pull people out of it by doing safe-to-fail experiments in parallel, or more like this, fewer like that. You don't tell people what the solution is. You do things which means they start to move in the right direction.
I think
Yeah. Well, it's an emergent property once you've done it. Yeah? Now, if the emergent behavior produces repetition, you can shift it over the complicated, and then you can scale it. Yeah? I mean, scaling in a complicated system is by aggregation and repetition, which is what things like SAFE try to do. Scaling in a complex system is decomposition and recombination in context, because you can't aggregate or reduce a complex system to its parts. So you have to make it into smaller things and allow them to recombine in different ways and then reinforce patterns quickly. Any more? I had people waving fingers at me a few minutes ago.
So I think we're good. The next session starts in a couple of minutes. So
Okay, sorry about that.
a couple of drinks, and then day 10 will be back up.
Slides will be up on the website tomorrow.